I've always been interested in leadership. Always. All the way back to the playground and how we assembled ourselves to play games and who got to pick whom. Later on in high school sports. Then on to the Navy, where I was a search and rescue diver. We talked a lot about leadership in that capacity. After college, to the Children's Defense Fund and working out the wonderful blueprint of Ella Baker, a great teacher of leaders. And then as a priest, and now as a bishop, I have thought a lot about leadership. What is it? What are its constituent parts? How do we develop it? How do you identify it, right? And I know I'm not the only one. I've gone to all the fancy schools and I've studied the thing with all of the modern masters. And it's been fascinating to learn what leadership is and what leadership isn't, and to know that it's a $40 billion industry with no agreed upon definition. And the bookshelves groan under the weight of trying to describe leadership and to commend it, both in the religious community as well as in the business community. Here's a definition. Leadership is the capacity to mobilize people to address tough problems, especially problems they'd rather avoid. One more time. Leadership is the capacity to mobilize people to address tough problems, especially problems they'd rather avoid. See how timely that is? Probably the best learning that I've ever had in trying to practice leadership and fail at leadership and occasionally succeed at leadership was about 9 years ago. I invited Ron Heifetz from the Harvard Kennedy School to come and to address our clergy and our lay people. And he got in town the day before the event. And I had taken all the classes and read all the books. Oh, what a bright boy I was. And I got him out to lunch, one of our wonderful skyscraper restaurants overlooking Stone Mountain. And there we are. And before the iced tea and the bread hit the table, I pounced. I was over him with all the definitions, and that I knew the lexicon, and that I had read all the fancy books and attended all the lectures, etc. And he listened, and he listened, and he listened patiently. And finally, he interrupted. I guess he couldn't bear it anymore. And he interrupted, and he said, you know what? If you're going to exert leadership, you're going to have to love. If you're going to lead change, you're going to have to love greatly. And there it was. It was one of those E.F. Hutton moments. The room fell silent. I was thunderstruck. Now, I knew that, but somehow the irony was that I was sitting at a table with a Jew, and he was telling me to love my neighbor. And, we went through the lunch, and it was all fine and all wonderful, but there it was, right in the center of things. I had begun to think of leadership as an amalgam of techniques rather than a delivery system of love. A delivery system of love. And then when I took this understanding to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to the Old Testament and to the New Testament, it was amazing now how the scriptures crackled with electricity. Now I could see Jesus' genius in yet one more way, how he handled formal authority, how he increased the circle of stakeholders, how he gave everybody a voice, how he was able to be gentle and bold at the same time. And then I realized some of the people that I had looked up to for a lifetime were doing this very same exercise. They weren't sort of adding a little love to their leadership, but actually love was at the forefront, in the middle, and at the back end of how they were leading. Indeed, it was just a delivery system for love. It's a qualitative shift, and for some it's a small point, but it has major impact, and it can go deep and broad. Jesus said our leadership ought to be distinct from others. It ought to be deep and wide, and it creates possibilities when we go there. In fact, the measure of our leadership is to include enemy. We should love enemy. Now, this is timely, don't you think? Because perhaps we are struggling now, not only with the divisions and the political and the economic and all of that, but we're struggling to add depth and new square footage to how we love. This is an important point, I do believe, and I think that the community of faith ought to be in the business that the guy we say we're following. Jesus was in the love business. A word about love. What do I mean? The sentiment? Hell no. Not the sentiment at all, but the soul force. Enough of those who pronounce love, but don't talk about what love requires. We talk about nonviolence in America, and you and I are sitting here as brothers and sisters because men and women paid the cost, suffered greatly. Indeed, some lost their lives so that you and I could be sitting here. It wasn't just love in general. It wasn't just swooning at the thought, right? But love had capacities, which had to be developed so that you and I could be here because they ran experiments to make it so. And this is the love that Jesus shows us. In the Old Testament, he followed a pattern. What do we see? We see the prophets, and the prophets are railing. Why are they railing? Not because they're sort of long-bearded, angry men with no social life. No, but because they understood that to love God deeply and to love neighbor deeply meant you felt deeply. And if the neighbor was offended, therefore you were offended, and some action was required. Read over in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Isn't this what Jesus is doing? He's expanding the circle of love. People are being included who should be just scandalized and sidelined. But he finds a way to make partners out of these folks, even stakeholders. And this is our work right now. If we're going to change the future of the church from a religious clique social society, in my tradition, with a polite snack at the end, to something robust and muscular that bears witness to the power of love, then you and I are going to have to increase our capacity to love. Oh, I've got 117 churches which I have the privilege of walking alongside, and I know of what I speak. You and I have got to go deeper and think bigger. The thing I like about this love business is that it creates space in the imagination. I've had a privilege of being alongside of people like Jim Lawson and C.T. Vivian and Ambassador Andrew Young. And to spend time with these folks is to begin to get a sense that it wasn't expertise or strategy that got them to the place that they got to, and they become such great partners for us and for our nation. It was because they went deep down in the love of Jesus Christ. We talk about nonviolence, and that's fine, but it really wasn't, the movement should have not been defined by what it was not, but rather defined by what it was. It was an abiding love movement. An abiding love movement. Violence is a constituent part of loving neighbor. What are the capacities? Because do you remember the definition? The capacity to mobilize people. What is the capacity? Well, we've got to begin to learn how to diagnose situations. In other words, what do I see? Jesus had a great gift for walking into a situation, looking into people's eyes, and seeing them. We've got to get better at diagnosing. Number two, we've got to get better at self-management. Self-management. We talk sometimes about not taking actions because of love, and I understand it, but I wonder sometimes if we don't take the actions that are necessary, particularly in our Christian congregations, not because we're so loving, but because we're so afraid. We're so afraid to tell the truth in love, to be kind, and to be candid. We're so afraid to name that which has to be named. Our self-management we have to work on our self-management. We have to figure out how to differentiate our ego from what needs to be done. We have to love enough to run the risks. That's all about self-management. We have to figure out how to use our strengths, our vulnerabilities, and our triggers in service to God's purpose. And then we've got to increase our capacity to energize others, to energize others. Isn't it amazing how Jesus energizes folks? How does he do it? I'm so glad you asked. Jesus has a clear idea about his purpose. Do you remember his first conversation with his mother that we have in Scripture? Woman, he says, I'm about my Father's business. I don't know if you could get away with that with your mom. I could never get away with that with my mom, calling her a woman. But Jesus is crystal clear about his purpose. And what do we know about purpose? Purpose is energy. Purpose, P-U-R-P-O-S-E. The first three words, the Indo-European word for fire. He was alive with fire. No wonder he was so magnetic as he wandered around Galilee and beyond. He was a guy who was clear about his purpose. He was about his Father. He was about God's business. And so one of the capacities that you and I have got to increase, not only in ourselves, but in the communities that we have the privilege of working alongside, is how do we get to our collective purpose? You know, most of us are perhaps affiliated with churches where nice will do. Just being nice will do. Well, nice is fine, but newsflash, nice is not actually in the Bible. No, kind is. And Jesus kindly found his way to his purpose and invited other people to their purpose because he knew that that is where the fire is. I've had a chance to talk to clergy and lay folks all over this country, and I run a little exercise that I want to tell you about. I ask people to write down their personal purpose statement. And people sort of are annoyed by the task, and they sit down and they write. And I say, write down your purpose. And don't use Pauline sentences. Don't write me a paragraph. Just nice and short, something concise. And they go through the exercise, and I go around the room. It's usually about 20 to 30 people. I go around the room. What is your purpose? What is your purpose? And they're all wonderful. They're all nice. I love the trees. I love the sunsets. Therefore, I will care for the creation, et cetera, et cetera. But I always pick out just one. Just one. And I pick out somebody, and I just sort of ask them, say it again. Why don't you? And they do. And I say, would you mind standing up? And they do. Now, all of a sudden, the hush falls over the room because people don't know what we're doing. I said, you are safe, and you are regarded, you are cared for. But in this moment, I want to push on you just a little bit. I say, okay. I said, tell us again your purpose. And I say, after they read it, so what? I mean, you could do lots of different things. Why this? And then they look sort of a little annoyed, as you would imagine. The whole room falls silent because we are at base fourth graders. Fight, fight, fight. And they wonder where we're going. And after a little time, and I've done this over 50 different locations, what happens always blows my mind. They get really quiet. The moment gets really still and serious. And they respond with a story. A story about something that happened in their life that fuels now what they do. Not long ago, I was in South Carolina talking, and I did this exercise, and a man stood up and he said, after this whole thing I've laid out, he said, you want to know why? You want to know why? Because I was so lost. I was so lost. And I don't want anybody else to be lost. He got down to his purpose. He got down to the furnace. He moved from the penthouse down to the furnace. And that fueled his energy. We've got to do this in our churches. COVID has given us a great excuse to get down to why these churches need to exist. We know how long they've been there. We know how much the budget is. We know who's on staff. We know that the attendance is declining. But do you know why they should exist? What do they have to say to the world now about who God is? That's the leadership work that you and I are called to do right now, that mobilizes people to address the tough problems. We can wring our hands and we can lament, but that's not good enough. Here's the thing I like about God. God is not looking for us to venerate God. God is looking for us to replicate God. And he gives us a blueprint in Jesus Christ. He says, come and do as I've done. Love as I have loved, right? And so we've got to love the world enough through these delivery systems called churches. We've got to love the hell out of the world. And praying isn't enough. Yeah, the climax of your prayer isn't amen, it's action. And so this is what I love about it. It's incarnational, the capacity to mobilize people. And look, it's already in you. And this is what's cool about Jesus' ministry. He called capacity out of people. And when did the capacity get in people? Well, you and I are made in God's image. It's already bundled in you. And so the work and the life with God is to pull it out of you for the world's sake. And that's the journey. So leadership is God's great gift to us. It's so sad that so many seminaries who are training lay and clergy leadership don't have a robust and wonderful program of leadership. It's just a little dollop here and a little salt shaker over there. But it's not a 3-year course about how to mobilize people to do this work. How will we turn around these churches? Where will we find the grit to close the ones that need to close and to plant the ones that need to be planted? We've got to create the capacity in one another to do this work. And God forgive us if we don't, because the world is hurting. And the world needs these beachheads, these medicine cabinets in the world. God needs them. Maybe we should interrogate why so many young people are not in our churches. Maybe they've discerned in us the gap between what we say and how we actually live, and they've decided to go somewhere else. That's another capacity, by the way, in leadership. The ability, the courage to be able to see the gap between what you say and how you actually live. And here's the beauty of this. In Christ Jesus, there is no condemnation, no shame, no guilt, no obligation. You and I have the courage through God, because we see ourselves through God's eyes, to say gaps are what humans do. But here's the good news. Leadership is the gift, so how we find our way across the gap. How do we find our way across the gap? We run faithful, data-driven experiments. That's what we do. Faithful, data-driven experiments across the gap. What should any church be doing right now? Running experiments. Running experiments based on what? On purpose. The experiments are guided by who we say we are in the world. What do we do when we leave this place? We figure out what our purpose is. We figure out what the organization that we sort of love and caring for, what that purpose is. And then we roll up our sleeves and we try to work there. Priya Parker has written us a wonderful book about the art of gathering. That's all she's saying, is that meetings will create energy if they're about purpose. Yeah. Dr. King was clear that you and I have got to have this purpose and do this work because love matters. Love matters, and love drives us. And if our purpose is to deliver love in a world that so often has loveless spaces, then aren't we privileged? Aren't we privileged to have real meaning for our lives? I love his definition of really active love. Love is overthrowing everything that is not love. In fact, he goes on to say love is rebelling against everything that is not love. Now that's love, isn't it? That's love that gives you the power to tell the truth, to name the gap, to increase stakeholders and partners, to find friends, to bless enemies, and to achieve the future of the world. Yes. In the Episcopal Church, which I'm privileged to worship in, we start off this thing called the Nicene Creed. Maybe you've heard of it. And we affirm together after the sermon that we believe in God, and then we do what I call the holy mumble through the rest of it. And it's sort of like the table of contents for the Christian faith, but that we end up with these few words: the life of the world to come. How will we get to the life of the world to come? Well, isn't it clear that that's where God is? God is working for the life of the world to come, and all the isms and all the schisms and all the inferior stuff will crack and crumble, and the only thing that will be left is love, the most durable chemical element in the universe. And what we get to do through the delivery system of leadership is to participate in God's victory, the victory that is already on the move. This is the leadership that is required of love. Love requires a certain brand of leadership. How privileged we are to participate here and now.